What I want to do is slow this down for just a moment and ask you to think about your life right now. Think even about the expectations that you often have in your mind. And I wonder how many of you wanted something in life, but right now you're experiencing the opposite. You thought that by this time I would be doing such and such, or I would be in this place, or I'd have this, or I would have accomplished this, or I would have had this relationship. And you really, really wanted something, but instead of achieving or accomplishing or having or being where you wanted, instead you're maybe at the exact opposite. Maybe some of you dreamed about having a great marriage, and that's exactly what you wanted. And you prepared for it, and you prayed about it, and you were pure, and you worked toward it with everything in you. And you married your sweetheart, and then years later, you ended up where you never wanted to be, brokenhearted and divorced. Maybe for you, you went to college and studied and got the degree, and felt like you were prepared to do something that would be meaningful. And now instead of being in a job that you love, you're in an unrelated job that seems like it's way beneath your education. And you wonder, how in the world did I get here? Maybe for you, it was that you got to a point in your life where you thought, I'd be married, or I'd be financially out of debt, or I'd be able to travel, or I'd have a ministry, or I'd be making a difference, or I would have started my business, or I'd be leading the business, or my kids would have been better off. And you find yourself waking up going, why am I not where I wanted to be? And you're so confused by it. If you ever wake up and think, this isn't what I wanted the exact opposite, the Apostle Paul knows exactly what you feel like. In fact, his story is incredibly emotional to me because he had a heart for God and only wanted to serve God and only wanted to please God. And he felt called to go to Rome to preach the gospel. And he knew if he could reach the people in Rome, that would be the strategic place to help the gospel spread all over the world. So his dream, his bucket list, his top prayer list, his greatest desire, his calling was to go to Rome to preach. And instead of being in Rome preaching, he finds himself in Rome as a prisoner, locked up in house arrest, awaiting possible execution. Everything that he wanted, and he got the exact opposite. Paul could have framed the situation in one of different ways. He could have framed it on the negative side, and this is what he would have said if he had framed it that way. From Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, from the NWV version. NWV stands for the New Whiners Version. He could have said this. He could have said, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what's happened to me really sucks. As a result of all the hell I've been through, I'm quitting life group and I'm never going back to church. That's what he could have said in the NWV. Now, for those of you that are new to church, I just want you to know that's not a real version of the Bible. I just feel like I should say that. You're like on your YouVersion about, where's the NWV? I can't find it. Anyway, that's my favorite version, okay? That's not real. What he did, though, is he reframed it. And I want to read you the verse. This is what the verse says. He said, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me, although it may really look bad to most people, it has actually served to advance the gospel. He said this, give me the next verse. He said, as a result, it's become clear to those in the palace guard, guess what? Even though it looks like I'm in bad shape, when I reframe it, it's clear to everyone else that I'm actually in chains for Christ. What's happening? I'm locked up to a Roman guard. 8 hours, every 8 hours, I get a new one. Who do you think the real prisoner is here? I'm getting to preach to a captive audience, and I get a new influential person every 8 hours. who has to sit there and listen to my 8-hour sermon on how good Jesus is. Verse 14, he says this, and because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become even more confident in the Lord. And guess what? It looks bad, but because I'm in chains, they are daring to proclaim the gospel even more boldly without fear. It's not the facts that are different, it's how you frame it. And what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about how you can reframe your story and your relationships. Because what I know right now, many of you, you got a battle going on in your mind. Your life may have some complications. Guess what? We all do. We all have stuff. Every single one of us. There hasn't been a day without some stuff. It's stuff in your family, it's stuff with your kids, it's stuff with your neighbors, it's stuff with the people you work with. Stuff. Bad doctor report stuff, bad behavior stuff, fighting with your spouse stuff, financial problem stuff, fear stuff, bad news on the news stuff, bad news in your family stuff, bad news in your extended family, stuff. And so often, so much of life is generally pretty decent, but often it's the small part of the stuff that ends up taking us out of God's perfect will. I want to talk to you about reframing your story and relationships, and I'm going to give you 3 specific tools that can help us renew our minds, win the war in our minds so God can change our thinking, which will change our life. Let me give you 3 really simple tools. The first thing is, number 1, is I want to encourage you occasionally to thank God for what didn't happen. To thank God for what didn't happen. I'll give you an example of this. There was a 20-year-old girl that said, Mom and Dad, I've got really bad news to tell you. I need you to sit down. And she said, let me tell the whole story, and I just want you to stay calm, but it's really bad news. I went out to a bar, I met a guy, we drank too much, he came back to my apartment, we hooked up, and I'm embarrassed to say I'm pregnant. The good news is that his probation will be over in a year, and he's going to start looking for a job once he's out of rehab. And he'll consider marrying me, but since we can't afford to get married now, he's just going to move in right now. And she let it hang for a moment. Then she said, actually, none of that's true. The truth is I got a D on my chemistry exam, and I just wanted you to know it could be a whole lot worse. There may be a time where some of you ought to thank God for what didn't happen in your kid's life, right? Well, I don't know what it would be, but maybe you missed your goal at work and you had a target so you could get your bonus, and you ended up not getting your bonus, and you feel devastated by that. But you can thank God that in a very challenged and compromised economy that you didn't actually lose your job, and suddenly you're reframing a situation rather than just focusing on what's wrong, you can actually see what's right. You might get in a car wreck. One of my kids not too long ago was getting a little fender bender. Oh my gosh, it's gonna be expensive, and there's insurance hassle and a deductible, and we're not gonna be in a car. Or you can say, you know what? Thank God nobody got hurt. Thank God that it wasn't that big of a deal. In the whole scheme of things, there are some things that are a big deal, but so often it's things that aren't that end up taking us off. And if you'll take a step back every now and then and look with a broader perspective, instead of focusing on what you hate, you may just change the frame and say, God, I thank you for what didn't happen. There's so many good things. I'm not going to let this one category take me off of being encouraged by your will. Thank God for what didn't happen. The second thing you can do is practice what we call pre-framing. Pre-framing. Deciding how you'll frame a situation before you engage in the situation. Why does this matter? Because our thoughts or frames often shape what we experience. If you go in and say, this meeting's gonna be horrible, I hate these people. It's so dull. You think you're going to have a good meeting? You're going to have a bad meeting. If you go in instead and say, you know what, we're going to do our best. We're going to be productive. We're going to enjoy the people that we're around. It's going to change. Oh, we're going out. I hate all this. I hate these stupid events. It's going to be a pain. These people. Oh, you know what? I'm thankful I'm with some people that I love. We're going to have a good time. The way you frame it often changes how you perceive it. And I'll give you an example of how I reframed a failure. Back in high school, one of the sports I played was tennis, and I've got some pictures of, evidently all I knew how to do was hit a backhand in the pictures, but my sophomore year, I played #1 singles for little Ardmore, Oklahoma. And in the state finals, I was in the quarterfinals. I was playing against the #4 ranked seed, a guy named Mandy Ochoa, who was a legend. So I'm an unranked, unseeded nobody against a senior. I'm a sophomore, and he was a legend. And somehow we split sets, one set to him, one set to me. In the third set, I was up 5-1, 40-love, against the #4 ranked player in the state. Big crowd, massive crowd of like 12 people gathered to watch this potential upset. And if I won any of the 3 next points, they're called match points. You win any one, and I win the match. Well, I didn't win those. He went on to do. I ended up having 7 match points in the third set. I was up 5-1, 40-love with 7 match points. I lost them all, and Mandy Ochoa came back to beat me 7-5 in the third set. Oh. And I developed a reputation and a nickname called Groeschel. If Groeschel gets in a tight match, he's going to tighten up and he's going to choke. And I started to own a very negative label. Thankfully, I had a great mentor and a coach who sometime later got up into my business, and essentially, he didn't use this term, but essentially he said, we're going to reframe that. What I want you to realize is you've been in some of the tightest matches around, and what have you learned? I said, I learned what doesn't work. He said, what doesn't work? Whenever you get tense, whenever you don't hit out. So what do you do in a tight match? He said, ask me. He said, you go for it. You bring more into it. You let loose. You bring your energy. You exhale, and you bring your best. You bring your all. And he said, what I want you to do is essentially reframe your situation. Because of your experience now, you are prepared to become a great pressure player. That very simple little thing, I'm telling you, I was just a kid. It has stayed with me to this day. Hey, I may have choked in some tight situations, but listen to me. Because of my experience, God has enabled me to be great under pressure. In the most complicated leadership situations, when I visualize how I will lead, I never see myself choking, never see myself failing. I see myself walking in with the power of God, His Spirit within me, completely confident. I will lead well because I'm a pressure player. I've already pre-framed it. Some of you're pre-framing your failure before you ever get there. Take whatever shortcoming you have, learn from it, pre-frame it, and walk in believing that God will enable you to be successful. What can you do? You can thank God for what didn't happen. You can pre-frame a situation. And the third thing is you can look for God's goodness. You can look for God's goodness, because I promise you, you will always find what you're looking for. If you look for the good, you can find good. If you look for the bad, you'll find bad. If you want to see what's wrong every single day, you can find what's wrong every single day. If you want to not like people, you can find a ton of reasons to not like people. But if you want to look for God, if you want to see faith, if you want to see the best, you can. It's just like the difference between a vulture and a hummingbird. What does the vulture find? Every day, vulture flies around. What does a vulture find? Dead stuff, dead things, roadkill. But what does a hummingbird find? Every day the hummingbird finds sweet things, I promise you, you'll always find whatever you're looking for. If you want to see what's wrong, what's bad, what's not working, what's wrong with the world, you can live a really depressed, negative life. But instead, if you want to look for where God is working, you can see He's still on the throne, and He's still good, and He's still powerful, and He still answers prayers. It's called cognitive reframing. And a good therapist will do a tool with you. Cognitive reframing is empowering you to decide the meaning of an event. You decide. I'm going to take it up a level and say this. Let's not just do cognitive reframing where you decide, but let's let Jesus help you decide the meaning of a situation. Let's let Jesus frame it for you. And I'll show you what this means to me. Amy and I were at an event recently. I spoke at a pastor's event with, there were probably 100, 125 pastors of what would be considered the most prominent churches in the country. Many of you would know many of the pastors who were there. It was interesting is almost to every single one, when we talked privately, they said last year was the worst year ever. And their spouses talked to Amy going, it was the worst year ever. And there was just this heaviness and this a sense from some almost of hopelessness of how do we recover in the church world. And I looked back over last year and have had those thoughts. And every single one of you in your own way had your own version of this. And so I don't want to pretend like my year was worse than yours, but you had some version. My version was, quarantined as like one of the first people in the country back in February, and then the church shut down. And there's this massive fear of like, what do you do when you can't meet? How do you even navigate through that for almost 3 months? Then there was if you reopen, you're dangerous, was what some of you thought. If you don't reopen, you got no faith, is what others of you thought. And then there was the whole mask thing, like meaning if you wear a mask, you're a flaming liberal. If you don't wear a mask, you're dangerous to the world. And I mean, we're talking about like hatred from Christians. And then there was the growing awareness of the racial tension. And even with the purest of intentions of trying to love people well, it doesn't seem like any of us got that exactly right. Then the political divide, which we all know so well, and here we find ourselves in the middle of a very difficult situation, looking, going, this was the worst year ever. Or was it? Because when I started looking back through my old pictures on my phone, I didn't see any of that bad stuff. And I'll show you just a small glimpse of what I saw. I was one of the first people quarantined, and I was exposed to the virus in Germany in February, came back, and for 14 days, didn't see Amy. This is the closest I got to her is this photo. This is me, the guy on the right down the bottom with a mask on and a shirt over his head. For some reason, I thought that would help the virus from jumping across the yard to get her. And I'm telling you right now it was the most intimate, spiritual, meaningful time with Amy. We FaceTimed and talked from across the house, and I fell more in love with her, not being with her. And it's amazing how much I loved her. Then my married daughters were quarantined back in like March and April. I don't know what they were doing, but somehow we ended up getting these 2 amazing little blessings. And then at church, we had some restructuring, which enabled my son-in-law, Luke, to get promoted to a youth pastor job at his church in the greater Tulsa area. And Anna and Luke bought their first house, and they didn't have a baby. They had a dog. And then that doesn't mean anything, but Amy learned to cut hair, which I thought was funny. But I got more time with my kids, and instead of working out in the gym, I worked out with my sons and had more time with them. And then I had what I call adventures with joy, where we went all over the place and we found some sort of a skull here. We're not sure if it's a cow head or a dinosaur head. We think it's probably a dinosaur head. But as I look back over the last year, it's easy at first glance to think it was the worst year ever. But actually, I see so many incredible blessings when I reframe it. And when you look at the church that had to close down for months, and then attendance is like half of what it used to be, but somehow, in the middle of that, my God, who is always faithful, managed to see more people come to Jesus last year than any year previous. And now when I look back, it doesn't seem so bad. It doesn't seem so bad. It's reframing. In other words, if God is working in all things for good, then it's time to reject the unhealthy thoughts. Do away with those frames that tell you can't and you won't and you're nothing and you're a failure and you're not smart, and we're going to reframe it. And what we're doing is we're not passively receiving circumstances, but we're actively interpreting it. And guess what? We're not interpreting the goodness of God through our circumstances, but we're interpreting our circumstances through the goodness of God. What has happened has actually served to advance the gospel, because you cannot control what happens to you, but you can control how you frame it. Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And when you know the truth will set you free.